Hello and welcome back. This is the third segment of our digestive system physiology lecture, and we will go from slide 101 to slide 115 in the original slide presentation, and that will conclude our lecture coverage of the digestive system. So as a reminder about where we've been and how we'll finish up, these are the topics that are covered in the entire digestive system lecture. And what we have left to cover here is the phases of digestion. So previously we've covered an overview of the organs and the functions of the digestive system. We talked about mechanisms that regulate the digestive system. That will come up again today. And then we talked about the processes that happen as food material travels from the mouth to the rectum and the anus. We're going to pick up with the phases of digestion, and we have previously covered this last bullet point here. Examining the phases of digestion requires that we take a step back, that we zoom out, so to speak, to look at digestive system processes as a whole. Prior to this, we've been immersed in studying the details of what happens in every region of the GI tract. What happens with motility, what happens with mechanical versus chemical digestion, etc. So now we get to take a step back and look at the system as a whole. And when a person ingests a meal, it takes between 24 and 72 hours for that meal to be fully processed. And by fully processed, I mean the food material travels from mouth to anus. So it's from ingestion to defecation, can take between, on average, 24 to 72 hours. And that depends. It depends on the person. Every body is a little bit different in terms of how quickly digestive system processes occur. And then every body is under the influence of the type of meal that was ingested, is under the influence of higher brain centers. So perhaps emotional stress will influence gastric motility, drugs, and so on. So 24 to 72 hours. And over that course, there are 3 phases of digestion, and they are named according to where they are initiated: the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. The word cephalic means head. So the cephalic phase of digestion is triggered before any food or beverage is ingested. And the stimuli for the cephalic phase of digestion include seeing food, smelling food, thinking about food, or even if it's the right time of day for you to take a meal, that cephalic phase of digestion is initiated. And these sensory inputs travel via the thalamus ultimately to the medulla oblongata, where motor output is initiated. Motor output arrives at the salivary glands in the form of an increase in parasympathetic stimulation, and that causes an increase in the production of saliva. And then motor output from the medulla oblongata arrives at the stomach, both in the muscularis of the stomach as well as the mucosa, the lining of the stomach. And the muscularis responds by increasing the rate at which it contracts and relaxes. And this gives rise to a churning action in the stomach. And maybe you've noticed that you can hear your stomach growling or grumbling, making rumbling sounds when you're hungry. And this is due to an increase in gastric motility during the during the cephalic phase of digestion. And then that motor output also arrives in the mucosa, the lining of the stomach, where we have those gastric pits. And those gastric pits include several different cell types, and each type of cell is responsible for producing a different component of gastric juice. And so collectively, gastric juice production increases. And so the motor responses during the cephalic phase of digestion are to really prepare the GI tract to receive food. Physiologically, you're getting ready to eat. And this is an innate reflex, so it's learned, it happens to everyone. And if we're not hungry, let's say you've just eaten and then you walk past, I don't know, some type of delicious smelling restaurant, you walk past a burger joint, but you've just eaten. So you might smell the burgers, maybe burgers are your favorite food, but this cephalic phase of digestion will be inhibited by your appetite center in your hypothalamus. And the cephalic phase of digestion can be modified by your learned experience. So for a person who eats meals at the same time every day, just the time of day can be sufficient to initiate the cephalic phase of digestion. So if you're at work and your job has nothing to do with food and you always take your lunch break at 1:30, just the fact that it's 1:30 can initiate the cephalic phase of digestion. Once we've eaten the food and food arrives in the stomach, that triggers the next phase, which is called the gastric phase of digestion. And gastric means stomach. So in the wall of your stomach, you have two different types of sensory receptors that are important for triggering the gastric phase of digestion. Number one, we have chemoreceptors in the mucosa, in that lining of the stomach. The tissue that it comes into contact with the food material includes chemically sensitive cells, these chemoreceptors, and they are constantly monitoring the pH of the contents of the stomach. And when we start to ingest a meal, we're taking bites of food and swallowing them. That has the effect of raising the pH inside the stomach. So you remember that gastric juice has a very low pH between 1 and 3. So that's very acidic. And we rarely eat foods that are that acidic, but most of the foods that we eat have a closer to a neutral pH. So with every bite of food, we're sort of diluting that gastric juice, and then the proteins in the food that we eat, it turns out those proteins combined with excess hydrogen ions. And so those proteins have the effect of raising the pH inside the stomach. And so those chemoreceptors detect that, and they send impulses to the site of integration, which is in the enteric nervous system, a local ganglion. The second type of sensory receptor we have in the stomach are stretch receptors in the wall of the stomach. And so they're constantly monitoring the degree of stretch, which is really an indicator of how much food is in the stomach. If your stomach is empty, there's very little stretch. If you've eaten a small meal, there's a little bit more stretch. But if you've eaten a tremendous amount of food, there's a great deal of stretch. And so those stretch sensitive cells are constantly firing, and the rate at which they fire indicates how distended or how stretched out the wall of the stomach is with food. And those sensory inputs travel as part of the enteric nervous system to a site of integration, which is going to be a local ganglion, and that's going to give rise to motor outputs. And motor output during the gastric phase of digestion affects the gastric glands as well as the smooth muscle in the sphincters and the wall of the stomach. So the glands that are in the wall of the stomach, they further increase their production of gastric juice. Okay, she's actually eating. We better make even more gastric juice. And that gastric juice is an important component for producing chyme, that liquidy material. And you remember that gastric juice also has a low pH that helps denature proteins, and it helps kill any pathogens that we may have ingested. And that gastric juice also includes a protein digesting enzyme called pepsin. And then another motor output, as that's part of the gastric phase of digestion, is to increase that gastric churning. So the mixing waves of the muscularis that started during the cephalic phase become even more intense. Okay, she's actually eaten. Now we really need to mix the food material up. And then at later phases during the gastric phase of digestion, those mixing waves coupled with relaxation of the pyloric sphincter will lead to the onset of gastric emptying. During gastric emptying, little bits of chyme leave the stomach and move into the duodenum. So this gastric phase of digestion is governed by both neural and hormonal mechanisms. And you remember the nervous system and the endocrine system are the two primary mechanisms of cell-to-cell communication. So we have stimuli and we have responses. And those effector tissues, the glands and the muscles, can be stimulated by nerves and or by hormones. So the sensory receptors that deliver the initial stimuli are stretch receptors in the wall of the stomach, and they respond to distension or a stretching of the stomach wall by firing at a faster rate. And then the chemoreceptors are constantly monitoring the pH of the contents of the stomach. And after a meal or during a meal, the pH inside the stomach begins to rise. Both the distension of the stomach wall and a rise in pH will trigger the release of gastrin. So gastrin is one of several GI tract hormones, digestive system hormones. There are several digestive system hormones. We are only going to cover two. Our first one shown here is gastrin, and when we make it to the small intestine, we'll talk about our second gut hormone called cholecystokinin. Please keep in mind that there are several other gut hormones that we're not covering. So, gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone. It's a circulating hormone, which means that it travels in blood. So gastrin circulates all over our body, but it has effector tissues, target tissues, that are part of the GI tract. So gastrin is secreted by enteroendocrine cells. These are hormone secreting cells that are part of the mucosa of the GI tract, the lining of the GI tract. And gastrin is secreted specifically by enteroendocrine cells that are in the mucosa of the stomach, part of the gastric pit. And so this circulating hormone gastrin has several target tissues, meaning tissues that will change their behavior in response to gastrin. So here we're looking at images of the stomach. The panel on the right shows the gross anatomy of the stomach, and I hope you'll recall that the mucosa is the lining of the GI tract, and here we're specifically interested in the mucosa of the stomach. So the panel on the left shows gastric pits, and those cells comprise simple columnar epithelial tissue. And as you can see, there are several different types of cells that form gastric pits. They're all secretory cells. They all produce and release something. And most of those components belong to gastric juice, but notice that the G cells at the very bottom, those do not create components of gastric juice, but rather they secrete a hormone called gastrin, and that gastrin diffuses into the blood. So gastrin has several target tissues, and the way a cell changes its behavior in response to a particular signaling molecule is called the action of that signaling molecule. So I hope you recall that the action, for example, the action of norepinephrine on autorhythmic fibers of the heart is to cause those autorhythmic fibers to generate action potentials at a faster rate. So now we're talking about the action of gastrin, and gastrin will cause those gastric glands to increase their production of gastric juice. Gastrin will also influence the lower esophageal sphincter, and that's that ring of smooth muscle that occurs between the esophagus and the stomach. And it causes that sphincter to contract, to sort of seal off the stomach and to prevent the contents of the stomach from moving up into the esophagus. So it has a protective effect. Another action of gastrin is to increase the intensity of those mixing waves in the stomach. So the muscularis starts to churn quite vigorously, and that's going to allow the chyme to mix with the recently ingested food. That's going to allow the gastric juice to mix with the recently ingested food material to produce this liquid called chyme. And then eventually, gastrin will cause the relaxation of the pyloric sphincter. And I hope you remember that the pyloric sphincter occurs at the junction of the stomach and the duodenum, the first region of the small intestine. So when that pyloric sphincter begins to relax, that valve opens up a little bit. And as that valve opens, gastric emptying happens with every successive mixing wave. With every churn of the muscularis of the stomach, a few milliliters of chyme are shot into the duodenum. And so overall, gastrin, with all of these target tissues, gastrin ramps up gastric secretion, that means the production of gastric juice, gastric motility, so these mixing waves, the churning action, and then gastric emptying, the movement of chyme from the stomach into the duodenum. And once we have chyme entering the duodenum, we initiate the third phase of digestion, which is called the intestinal phase of digestion. And this is another set of reflexes that they all work together to slow the rate of gastric emptying. And this is because, I hope you remember, that the greatest amount of chemical digestion and the greatest amount of absorption happens in the small intestine, and those things take time. In order to adequately or to completely chemically digest the food material, we need lots of enzymes and we need lots of time. And in order to adequately absorb the resulting smaller molecular building blocks that we call nutrients, in order to absorb those nutrients, that requires time and a mixing of the chyme, and the chyme has to come in contact with those absorptive cells of the intestinal epithelium. So gastric emptying needs to occur slowly. Little bits of chyme need to be delivered into the small intestine so that the small intestine has adequate opportunity to do its job. And the major jobs of the small intestine are chemical digestion and absorption. So I hope you also remember that the processes that occur in the small intestine require the cooperation of the pancreas and the liver and the gallbladder. So part of the intestinal phase of digestion involves increased secretion of pancreatic juice and bile. So like the other two phases of digestion, the intestinal phase of digestion is governed by both neural and hormonal mechanisms, and those are avenues for cell-to-cell signaling, right? How does one tissue or one part of the body communicate with another part of the body? So we have these same two types of sensory receptors that are responsible for initiating the intestinal phase of digestion. How do we know that the chyme is moving into the small intestine? Well, we know that two ways. We have stretch receptors that are in the wall of the duodenum, and as the duodenum fills with chyme, it stretches. And then we have chemoreceptors in the mucosa of the duodenum, the lining of the duodenum. The cells that are in contact with the food material include chemoreceptors. These chemoreceptors, like the chemoreceptors that are present in the stomach, these chemoreceptors in the small intestine, they are sensitive to pH. They are constantly monitoring the pH, and so what do you think would happen to the pH inside the duodenum as gastric emptying occurs? So the duodenum is now receiving chyme. What's going on with the pH in the small intestine? Is it increasing or decreasing? It's decreasing because that chyme has a low pH due to the low pH of gastric juice. And so that decline, that drop in pH is a reliable signal that chyme is coming in. And then additionally, these chemoreceptors are also able to respond to the presence of fatty acids and amino acids. And those are pretty reliable signals regarding the composition of the meal that we've eaten. Did we eat a very high carb meal? Did we eat a meal that's very rich in fat? Did we eat a meal that's very rich in protein? And so these modified sensory receptors send sensory input to the site of integration, which is locally part of the enteric nervous system. And the enteric nervous system, the motor output comprises part of the enterogastric reflex, and then it also involves the secretion of our second gut hormone, cholecystokinin. The enterogastric reflex is part of the intestinal phase of digestion, and it's a reflex. And I hope by now you remember that a reflex includes sensory inputs, integration, and motor output. So the primary source of sensory input for the enterogastric reflex is distension of the duodenum wall. So the stretching of the wall is the sensory input that leads to these two major forms of motor output: a decrease in gastric motility along with contraction of the pyloric sphincter. So the enterogastric reflex slows or decreases the intensity of that churning action of the muscularis, the layers of muscle of the stomach. They slow down. And simultaneously, that pyloric sphincter, the valve between the stomach and the small intestine, that begins to contract, which slows the rate of gastric emptying. The valve narrows, and so less chyme is entering the duodenum. So this really puts the brakes on gastric emptying. It leads to a slower influx of chyme into the duodenum, and that allows for more chemical digestion and more absorption. The intestinal phase of digestion also involves the secretion of a hormone, cholecystokinin, and this is our second gut hormone that we're covering along with gastrin, and we are not covering any other gut hormones, but they do exist. So cholecystokinin is also known as CCK, and it's a circulating hormone, meaning it travels in your blood, and it's produced by enteroendocrine cells that are part of the mucosa of the duodenum. So these are hormone-producing cells that are part of the lining of the first region of the small intestine. And cholecystokinin is really, the secretion of CCK is mostly under the influence of sensory input from those chemoreceptors in the lining of the duodenum. So when those chemoreceptors respond to a greater presence of fatty acid and a greater presence of amino acids, it leads to the greater secretion of cholecystokinin. And so the presence of fatty acids and amino acids, they indicate what type of meal we've eaten, right? Fatty acids are part of triglycerides, and then amino acids are part of proteins. So cholecystokinin is secreted to a much greater degree if we've eaten a fat-rich, protein-rich meal versus, say, a carbohydrate-rich meal. And so cholecystokinin, it is a circulating hormone, and it can affect the behavior of several different tissue types. So these are the actions of CCK. CCK influences the behavior of the pancreas. Those acinar cells will begin to secrete more pancreatic juice, and pancreatic juice that is particularly rich in lipases and proteases, fat digesting and protein digesting enzymes. CCK will also act on the gallbladder, and it will stimulate secretion from the gallbladder, the secretion of bile, into the duodenum. So under the influence of CCK, more bile, more pancreatic juice are delivered into the duodenum. And then CCK also helps to slow the rate of gastric emptying by helping to stimulate contraction of that pyloric sphincter. And then we know that CCK also influences or acts on the hypothalamus to bring about a feeling of satiety or being full, no longer being hungry, being satisfied. So overall, cholecystokinin will slow gastric emptying and rev up digestive system processes that occur in the duodenum. So the rate of gastric emptying depends on the type of meal we ingested. Maybe you've noticed this. If you eat a very carbohydrate-rich meal, maybe you eat some pasta with tomato sauce. That's a very carbohydrate-rich meal, and maybe you notice you become hungry or you're ready to eat another meal in a shorter period of time relative to, I always say, McBurger Jack, right? You go and you get a quarter pounder or some big burger at a fast food restaurant that's just full of protein and fat. And you have the experience of that burger sitting in your stomach for hours and hours and hours. Well, it really does. Yeah, it's getting churned and turned into chyme. But a carbohydrate-rich meal will be moved from the stomach into the duodenum at a faster rate than a fat and protein-rich meal. And this is because carbohydrates are relatively easy to digest. So we have salivary amylase that starts that digestive system process. We have pancreatic amylase that continues the carbohydrate digesting in the small intestine. And then we have several brush border enzymes that finish up the chemical digestion of carbohydrates in the small intestine. Well, lipids and proteins, especially the proteins, are much bigger, more complicated molecules. You remember that proteins can be thousands of amino acids long, and they're folded in these very complex three-dimensional ways, so they have to be denatured. There are a whole variety of protein digesting enzymes that cut specific bonds between specific pairs of amino acids. And so we have quite an array of protein digesting enzymes, starting with pepsin in our small intestine, and then pancreatic juice includes several different proteases. We only talked about two, trypsinogen and chymotrypsinogen, or those are the zymogens that give rise to trypsin and chymotrypsin. But there are many more protein digesting enzymes that we haven't talked about. And then lipids. The chemical digestion of lipids depends heavily upon pancreatic lipase. It's a component of pancreatic juice. And then I hope you remember that lipids need to be emulsified by bile. So that's a step that is not required by carbohydrates or proteins. And then the absorption of lipids is more complicated. They're fat soluble. It involves the micelles and the formation of chylomicrons in the lymphatic system. So proteins and lipids take more time and more resources to digest and absorb. And so when those chemoreceptors in the duodenum, when they detect that you've eaten a protein-rich / fat-rich meal, they further, or the motor output helps to further slow the rate of gastric emptying, so that just little bits of chyme get delivered into the duodenum. So there's plenty of time to digest and absorb those fats and those proteins. And so it means that the chyme stays in the stomach longer. So we've talked about 3 different digestive system reflexes, and the top 2 here, the gastroileal reflex and the gastrocolic reflex, we covered previously in the second segment. And today, I've just finished talking about the enterogastric reflex. So here's a little tip for keeping these reflexes straight. They're all reflexes. So there's a site of sensory input, and then there's a site of motor output. And we can look at the breakdown of the word to determine where sensory input occurs and where motor output occurs. So let's take the gastroileal reflex. Gastro means stomach, and ileal refers to the ileum, the third and final region of the small intestine. So the first part of the word gastro, that's the site of sensory input. And the second part of the word, ileal, is the site of motor output. So I'll remind you that the gastroileal reflex is triggered by the arrival of food in the stomach. So you've eaten, the wall of your stomach has stretched, the pH inside your stomach has risen, and there's motor output that occurs in the ileum. Peristalsis in the ileum increases to push the chyme from the small intestine downstream into the large intestine. So this brings us to the end of the digestive system, and this is what we've covered over the course of the 3 different segments. Today, in the 3rd segment, we just talked about the phases of digestion. Thanks for watching.